Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 3 of our 3-part series with Dr. Brendan Engen on Archetypal Synchronistic Resonance. Dr. Engen is a clinical psychologist from Waycross, Georgia, and is co-author with me of a paper published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology back in 2007 titled Archetypal Synchronistic Resonance, a New Theory of Paranormal Experience. Welcome again, Brendan.
Thank you. Thank you.
In this, our third of 3 episodes on the theory of archetypal synchronistic resonance, we want to both go a little deeper, but also for the benefit of viewers who haven't watched both of the earlier episodes, recapitulate a bit.
Sure. Well, archetypal synchronistic resonance is essentially a theory of paranormal experience, which would include anything like telekinesis, psychokinesis, reincarnation or rebirth experiences, anything that seems to fall outside of kind of conventional experiencing. It's intended to provide some way of coming to terms with the data, making sense of the data in a way that, as I said in the article, in a way that doesn't just accept it uncritically, but at the same time doesn't dismiss it outright.
Looks at it primarily from a psychological perspective rather than, let us say, a religious or metaphysical perspective or a hostile, skeptical perspective.
I think we've tried to keep it very phenomenologically based, tried to keep it very based in the experience. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think it's important to emphasize that the context in which you and I came to write about this approach had to do with reincarnation.
Yes.
And not just any kind of reincarnation, because within the discipline of parapsychology, there's a large body of literature referred to as cases of the reincarnation type.
Right.
These are cases where young children remember having been another person and describe those memories very much in the first person. Say, I was so-and-so, I lived here, I did this and I did that, and I had these relatives. And researchers have collected over 2,500 cases of this type, and roughly half of them have been corroborated.
Yes,
the information provided by the children is real.
Absolutely.
Verifiable and verified. And many of these children even have birthmarks associated with the death wounds of the previous personality.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's not the kind of case that we're talking about, because neither you nor I have memories.
I have no memories
of having been ancient Roman philosophers. And so really the applicability is more along the lines of a popular approach to reincarnation.
Right.
Many people develop ideas through past life regressions or through psychic readings.
Absolutely.
And it's especially applicable there. I think it's fair to say as well, if we look at the history of the multiplicity of religions, there are probably over 1,000 different religious bodies in this world.
Absolutely.
Maybe many thousand for all I know. And often it would seem that these religions are founded on the basis of archetypal synchronistic resonances.
Absolutely, absolutely. I would agree. I think that one of the core components of archetypal synchronistic resonance is the idea of sort of action at a distance. That, and this is more or less what Jung said initially in his construal of synchronicity, that these events that are occurring seem to have some sort of meaningful relationship, yet our understanding of how one could cause the other doesn't seem to fit.
Yeah.
Let
me interrupt you for a second, because as I recall, Jung was specific.
Yeah.
He said that he didn't see any transfer of energy involved, and therefore, in his mind, it must be acausal.
It must be acausal.
So
that's right.
Now, a philosopher could look at that and break it down and say, well, do you really need an energy transfer?
Sure. Yeah.
Can't causality be based on information, not just energy? I think information theorists today would look at it a little differently.
Indeed, absolutely. And I think that's right. No, I think the traditional construal, does tend to regard those kinds of events as either impossible, or if they occur, they're usually considered to be miraculous. And usually that term, miraculous, is defined within the context of that person's particular religious view.
Yeah, usually a miracle means it's validation from God up above.
That's right.
That this is the one true religion.
Absolutely.
Every other religion that claims miracles is deluded.
Yes, absolutely. And I can speak just from my own clinical work, where I've had many patients that I believe have had valid synchronistic experiences. The vast majority of them did interpret it within the system they were brought up in, or the system that they had converted to.
And where you work in southern Georgia,
Absolutely.
right in the heart of the Bible Belt, I can just imagine what that's like.
Absolutely. So it for instance, in Pentecostal spirituality, there seems to be, in Christian Pentecostal spirituality, there seems to be some room for kind of allowing people to have these experiences, so to speak.
Gifts of the Spirit.
Gifts of the Spirit, absolutely. And people report
They're
healings.
Not all the work of the devil.
They're not all the work of the devil, that's right. And they probably do have their own way of trying to discern the difference.
Well, that's the key, because they use that word, discernment.
Right, yes.
And from what I gather, it's not as if they have a hardcore method for this discernment,
Absolutely.
But they believe that a spiritually evolved person knows how to discern.
So the discernment itself is considered to be sort of an act of grace, or something divinely bestowed. And so that's been my usual sort of experience, hearing about other people's experiences of archetypal synchronistic resonance within the context that I practice in. I will say, however, though, especially in the other places I've practiced, for instance in San Francisco and in Berkeley, there, when I heard of accounts like this, synchronistic accounts, often it would have a different sort of conceptualization. It could be understood maybe in a Buddhist sense, or maybe kind of a New Age sense, or even a pagan sense. So often very similar experiences would get sort of absorbed into the cognitive system of the person whose experiences they were, but they'd be interpreted very differently, one to the other. And that's an interesting kind of
Well, in our
issue.
Previous interview, Part 2, we introduced the concept of apophenia.
Yes.
And apophenia is a term used by skeptics to mean the false attribution of meaning to a coincidence that's really intrinsically meaningless.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that would be the standard skeptic response to our account, to say, well, look, this is just, you guys are probably sincere, but this is just apophenia. We're just not thinking about this properly. We're processing the information.
You're creating an entire mythological structure around your lives.
That's
and
right.
it may be you're reinforcing to your egos.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, you're distracting yourself from the rational realities that adults should be paying attention to.
Absolutely. And so, they would more or less interpret what we've experienced, I think, in terms of just mere chance. These are random, sort of natural occurrences. We happen to both be involved. We happen to both have very similar resonances, so to speak, but there's really nothing mystical about it.
In fact, there's a school of philosophy called naturalism,
yes,
which maintains that any account of reality that invokes the transcendental,
yes,
or the supernatural,
yes,
however you want to phrase it, but even the transcendental
yes,
is off bounds, out
absolutely,
of limits. It simply violates the fundamental axiom of that school of philosophy. It cannot be true.
Right.
Therefore, even prior to any investigation,
yes, indeed,
as a parapsychologist, I would have to argue, no, you look at the empirical evidence first.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I would qualify that a bit. I think that view, I might call that view scientific materialism, which is the view that we're essentially just atoms in the void, and there are laws, scientific laws that are verifiable, that explain every occurrence, and every event has a cause. That's a physical cause. That's a scientific materialist view. Yeah. There are forms of naturalism that I think can encompass the sacred, the dimension of the sacred, in that they might say that, as I talked to you a bit about previously, there's a philosopher by the name of Robert Corrington who alludes to this. He has a radically naturalistic account. In other words, he believes nature is ultimate. That's the view of naturalism. There's really nothing outside or beyond nature, but he would say that nature is a lot weirder than we think. I suspect that's how he might construe it, and that it does have, as he put it, its sacred folds, its sacred dimension, and those are real. They're not apophenic responses or projections. So not every version of naturalism would necessarily subscribe to an exclusively skeptic view, I think, of our account.
But the key is, how do you discern?
How do you discern? Absolutely. And that, I don't know exactly what the answer is to that. But I should go into some discussion about apophenia and why we think it's relevant.
Okay.
There are people that do have experiences where they link events together or situations together in ways that are very irrational.
Yes.
Not just irrational, but very destructive, typically. Yes. So apophenia can often be very harmless. So, for instance, a person may have a psychotic belief that they can communicate with trees, or that if there's a certain pattern in the carpet, it has some significance for what they need to be doing. That would be kind of an extreme example of an apophenic projection. Some forms of apophenia, though, can be, very destructive.
But some forms of actual synchronicity can be
that's
very
exactly
destructive.
That's
not apophenia.
That's not just apophenia, but I'll get into that as well. But just looking at apophenia for a second, I've had patients, in fact, who've done things to themselves, or who've even done things to other people that they wouldn't have done if they weren't in a psychotic state, that were very harmful. And they did so because they were projecting something onto those situations that was just baseless.
Well, in the most extreme cases, you have people who believe that God is telling them to commit a murder.
Right, indeed, and those things, those occurrences do happen.
Yeah.
So that would be an example of an apophenia that is obviously it's untrue, but also it's very destructive.
Yes.
And so there's going to be. I think there's going to be a lot of a true skeptic is going to try to give a lot of attention to that, to say, well, are you walking down a dangerous road here?
Right. Are you encouraging people
courting? That's right. That's right.
By writing about archetypal synchronistic resonance, are we encouraging religious fanatics to commit murder?
Exactly. That would be a complaint.
Yeah.
And I would say, no, we're not. And as you mentioned before, even with what I would consider to be genuine archetypal synchronistic resonant experiences, that is, that I believe these things really happened, and that there really was a meaningful link between the events that the people reported, they can sometimes be very destructive.
Well, Dr. Jewel Eisenbud, the late Jewel Eisenbud, was a psychoanalyst who wrote a wonderful book called Parapsychology and the Unconscious. And he described many of his patients having authentic psychic experiences that had a bad ending to them. And what he said is that people who have a subconscious self-destructive impulse but are also gifted psychically are at risk, because their psychic gifts may come into the service of their self-destructive impulse.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is Corrington discusses this as well in his work, that the divinity that we do find in nature, it can be somewhat morally ambiguous, at least from a human standpoint. That is, that it can be very destructive. He cites things that we see in extreme cases of psychopathology as examples, where it appears as if, for instance, from a certain kind of psychoanalytic viewpoint, it appears as if, almost as if the unconscious is attempting to reabsorb the conscious ego of the person, which must be a terrifying experience for people going through that.
Like in schizophrenia.
Like in schizophrenia, exactly. Absolutely, absolutely. And he would be the first to say that, I think he does discuss how the Jungian collective unconscious is kind of tied into nature, so to speak, into the Jung spoke about the unus mundus, the kind of the unifying reality that brings together mind and matter, and that can either involve experiences that hinder or even destroy or help the person whose experiences they are. So I just wanted to kind of make that point that archetypal synchronistic experiences or apophenic experiences aren't just always harmless things. Sometimes they can be destructive.
They can be destructive, either apophenia or authentic archetypal synchronistic resonance, or they can be healthy. I mean,
or they can be healthy.
In my case, I have to say, I think of myself as a healthy, happy, well-balanced, successful person in life. And the fact that I'm here with you on the video is the demonstration of that to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I love this.
Absolutely.
I love this. But it could have worked out very differently.
Right, absolutely. And I feel the same in my case. I think typically I've had probably more than one ASR experience in my life, and certainly have had more than one.
ASR
meaning archetypal synchronistic resonance experience.
For those who haven't figured that out,
that's right. And I think in all of the cases that I've personally experienced, they were helpful. They led to something that I couldn't have accomplished just through conscious means. They kind of opened something up in my life that ended up being very kind of vitalizing or energizing. And I think that's one thing that Jung would emphasize, and Frankl actually would emphasize about these experiences, is that they're vitalizing experiences. They seem to kind of activate a different level of vitality.
Well, let's look back on the one we've been describing. It's been over a decade since you first reached out to me and said, are you the incarnation of Seneca? How has that colored your life?
Well, I think it's what's interesting is at that time, I was just about to embark on my career. I just finished up my doctoral program. Really didn't have, I really didn't have a whole lot of certainty about what was going to happen next. I was certainly considering, different options, but having that conversation with you, I think, empowered me to think about maybe pursuing some things in my life that I probably wouldn't have pursued otherwise, some interests that I wouldn't have pursued. And that ultimately, I think, led me to, build the practice that I've been able to build ultimately. And I have a feeling that I might have been. I will say this: I think I was more empowered to go into private practice after having that experience. It did something. I think it may have elicited a bit more sort of. A feeling of self-empowerment.
You could be your own person.
I can be my own person. I can do this, and there is a feeling of sort of, like we said, sort of cosmic or divine validation, and so that I think added to that. I think things could have turned out very differently if I hadn't had that experience. I could have ended up in a practice where I didn't have the same kind of freedom or the same kind of inner direction, so to speak. So I do think it was very helpful for me, absolutely. And that, that I think that it always touches on some personal element, these experiences.
Well, I can say for myself, for what it's worth, that my introduction to Seneca by the hypnotist, Dr. Martin Rossman, was as your inner healing advisor. That was over 30 years ago.
Yes.
And I've come to appreciate that the word healing in this context isn't just medicine. It's a kind of a spiritual thing, because Seneca was in effect a spiritual teacher.
Yes, yes.
And a person, when he said, study my life, a person whose life touched the greatest heights of human achievement in the context of his era.
Absolutely.
And some of the greatest depths as well. His exile and isolation on a lonely island where he was desperate to get back to Rome. Gave me an appreciation for a sense of intimate contact with a life much larger than my own, to be honest.
Yes.
And imbued with a sense of vitality. As well. Now, I don't think all of that qualifies as reincarnation.
No.
Maybe it comes close.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. When I think was significant in both of our cases with that resonance with Seneca is the activation of the hero archetype, that we each were kind of in our own way kind of propelled on sort of a hero's journey.
Seneca's a philosophical hero.
He's a philosophical hero, and he's someone that one can look to as a model in that way. Having, as you said, having faced very extreme adverse circumstances, but also having tasted, some of the heights and some of the greatest achievements. In many accounts of heroes, that's what we see.
I don't think Seneca's well known to most people
that's
today,
true.
Although his impact is actually, he's the person, for example, who first said, live each day as if it were your last.
That's interesting. Absolutely.
Which is probably why the biographer I read said he was more prepared than anybody except perhaps Socrates to face his own death.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. Absolutely. He had an enormous influence, I think, on Western culture. That's true. Unfortunately, his name isn't well known nowadays. But what's interesting, I have seen kind of an increasing interest in Stoicism and in Seneca, especially. I've seen many books written by many of them by psychologists recently, talking about their ideas and not just relating to their therapeutic content, but really looking at kind of their spiritual bearing as well, which I think is very significant. So he may be kind of experiencing something of a renaissance or sort of a revival, so to speak.
Well, I do know other people who have this sense of an uncanny identification with historical figures. For example, I interviewed Jean Houston, who's one of my favorite people in the world.
Absolutely.
And one of the favorite people I've ever interviewed. And she had, I told her about the Seneca connection, and she said, I have something similar. She said, when I was a child, I kept repeating this phrase, hocus pocus, where is Proclus? and as a result, she came to realize, Proclus was I believe, a Neoplatonic philosopher from the ancient period of Greece. And
that's right.
She began to realize she had an affinity for this ancient philosopher.
That's fascinating. And he wrote a very sophisticated kind of polytheistic theology incorporating Neoplatonic ideas. I know her work kind of touches on a lot of guard archetypes.
Indeed, she's an archetypal psychologist, was a close colleague of Joseph Campbell, for example, and she's often felt that, frankly, polytheism is much richer psychologically than monotheism. Monotheism seems to almost encourage a closing down of the mind in some ways, where polytheism opens us up to all the potentials of the gods and the goddesses within.
Absolutely. And Proclus certainly would agree. Absolutely. Well, that's very interesting. Yes.
So, I can say in the last decade, the notion of archetypal synchronistic resonance. It has not created a revolution in the field of psychology, but maybe more people will come out and say, yes, that applies to me.
Yes.
We can develop a database of examples
Absolutely.
of that, other than the unique series of synchronicities that you and I shared.
Absolutely, and I think that'd be wonderful if we could see that development. Absolutely.
That would be, I suppose, the next step. If we're going to develop archetypal synchronistic resonance as a meaningful contribution to psychology or parapsychology, it's important to collect case studies.
Yes, absolutely.
So perhaps our viewers, in fact, can help out by contributing.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. And I'm sure we'd find some very interesting cases to review. I think even synchronicity itself as a concept is something that's becoming more and more accepted. In fact, unfortunately I don't recall his name, but I came across the work of a psychiatrist recently who he's written books in neuropsychiatry and other areas, but he has a whole website devoted to synchronicity. His book hasn't yet been published. It comes out in March. And I want to get it, and I'll get you the name of this person. I can't recall it at the moment. But he believes that synchronicity may be associated with certain areas of the brain, and that he believes that synchronicity is real. It's not just a projection, and that it typically has some sort of adaptive advantage for the person whose experience it is.
Well, there is a growing body of literature on that.
Yes.
Well, Brendan Engen, thank you so much for sharing these 3 half hours with me on a topic dear to my heart, and I think dear to your heart as well.
Absolutely, very much so.
Archetypal synchronistic resonance.
Yes. Thank you very much, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us. Thank you.